The reckoning under the cold lights of the hospital, a place where only hope and comfort should reign. He delivered a brutal blow to his pregnant wife. The echo of her broken breath and a muffled cry froze the entire hallway. No one imagined that, just a few hours later, the nightmare would turn against him. Her father, a renowned CEO, appeared not with fists, but with power and intellect. Each signature, each calculated decision, erased everything he owned. From the pinnacle of his arrogance to the abyss of ruin, he never suspected that the instant he lost his family would also be the moment his empire crumbled. The hallway of the Valencia General University Hospital seemed suspended in a clean, white light, with that familiar scent of disinfectant mixed with the hushed murmur of supply carts and the hurried steps of nurses. Outside, March showed its festive and warm character, and from time to time, like a heartbeat from the street, one could hear the ordered rumble of a mascleta, a firecracker display. In the waiting room, a few family members sipped coffee from a machine and commented on the weather. Inside the private room, Eleanor Vega Morales, her 7-month belly gently lifting the sheet, breathed deeply to organize her thoughts. She had put on a blue hospital gown and kept her hair tied back, more out of habit than coquetry. Dr. Patricia Morales Lopez, with a serene voice and efficient movements, checked the baby's heartbeat on a screen and nodded occasionally, as if accompanying with her gesture that minimal music that beats in all maternity wards. James Torres arrived with his suit still perfect, though his eyes showed a hint of fatigue. He greeted them in a low voice and asked, with a rehearsed cordiality, how they were. Eleanor looked away toward the window, because the simple answer she wanted to give, "We're fine," found no room in her throat. The conversation began with short phrases, then lengthened, reaching that uncomfortable mix of old reproaches and repeated promises. Dr. Patricia, who had seen many births and families in her time, tried to redirect the temperature of the conversation. She suggested that Eleanor rest. She invited James to get some air in the cafeteria. She reminded them that the baby listens, that it's important to be mindful of one's mood. Rafael Campos Ruiz, the security guard on duty, had passed through the hallway twice. He knew many people in Valencia by sight, and although he avoided confidences, he inadvertently learned of others' silences. He had recognized James from the newspapers, that son-in-law who had been featured a few months ago at a charity gala, always next to Eleanor, always confident in front of the cameras. He considered continuing his rounds, but the murmur inside the room grew louder, and he decided to stop for a few seconds, without intruding, attentive, in case someone needed help. The discussion turned toward those words one believes are harmless, and which, through repetition, sting more than shouts. Eleanor said she needed calm, that the obstetrician had insisted on avoiding stress. James replied that he had come from work and that everything was exploding for him, that she didn't understand what he had on his hands. Dr. Patricia approached, gently placed a hand on the back of the chair, and asked them to postpone any delicate topics. Someone in the hallway talked about buñuelos. Another person mentioned the schedule for the flower offering. Brief laughs and the echo of soft-soled shoes were heard. Then, the conversation in the room broke. No one needed to say more. It was enough that there was a choked exclamation, an icy silence, and the way Eleanor instinctively brought one hand to her face and the other to her belly, with that ancient gesture of protection that everyone understood in a second. Dr. Patricia intervened and asked for space. James took a step back and said he was sorry, that it had been a moment that wouldn't happen again. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and breathed slowly, obeying the doctor, who took over with professionalism and calm, as if each number were a small lighthouse in the middle of a storm. Raphael didn't enter. It wasn't his place, but his experience told him that some alarms don't sound over the loudspeakers and still demand attention. He moved closer until the nurse on duty looked at him with a question in her eyes, and he responded with a look that said, "I'm here, just in case." The hallway returned to order. A woman passed with a cup of hot chocolate bought from a corner stand. Someone spoke on the phone in a low voice, perhaps to a child studying in another city. The hallway clock marked mid-morning. Dr. Patricia leaned in and explained to Eleanor, with the pedagogical tone that comes with custom, that the body reacts, that the baby is fine, that she should rest and avoid arguments. She offered her water. She told her to close her eyes for a moment if she could. James wanted to place the bouquet on the bedside table, but left it on the metal chair. He reached for Eleanor's hand and found only air. He apologized. He repeated it twice, now without embellishments, with the breath of someone who fears losing ground they believed was firm. Eleanor didn't say anything at first. The light in Valencia has a way of coming through the windows that feels like a caress, and perhaps for that reason, when she looked up, her expression was closer to clarity than reproach. A new awareness was breaking through. The woman who had learned to justify without pause was now evaluating, with a simple lucidity, the value of each word and the weight of each gesture. She remembered, without drama, the bouquets of flowers from other times, and the wasted afternoons waiting for an explanation that never came. She remembered her mother's voice, that ancient prudence that life was now returning to her as a compass. Dr. Patricia continued with her checks. She talked about lunchtime. She recommended something light. She mentioned that the hospital cafeteria served good salads, and that in Valencia everyone knew how to find good arroz, even on a Tuesday. James said he would go get something, and they would return to talk calmly later. Raphael let him pass and followed him with his gaze, not to monitor him, but to be attentive to his return. The nurse brought a thin blanket and closed the curtain a little to block the light. Eleanor thanked her for the gesture and returned to breathing at the rhythm she had learned in her childbirth preparation classes. The monitor drew a reliable line, and that, at that moment, was the best embrace. The doctor made a final note, and, before leaving, leaned in just enough so that her voice didn't have to be raised. She said she would be close by, that all she had to do was press the button, and that she preferred serenity to heroics. Eleanor nodded and closed her eyelids. She didn't sleep, but she allowed her body to stop fighting. When she opened her eyes, she saw the bouquet on the chair, motionless, too perfect, and she thought of the word appearance. The baby moved with a gentle nudge, and she, for the first time in a long time, felt she could respond with a concrete promise. Raphael returned to his post next to the elevator. An elderly couple asked for a floor, and he accompanied them to the sign with patience. He wished them a good day with that courtesy that brings relief to closed spaces. The man replied with a brief joke about the noise of the phallus and their ears. The woman smiled, and the humanity of that exchange left a simple serenity that Raphael treasured. Back in his chair, he sat for a moment looking at his own phone. He was not a man of impulse. Some people, by dint of listening to confidences and attending to those who arrive nervous, learn to distinguish where a gesture is needed. He thought of the first time he had seen Eleanor, years ago, entering with her father, Don Alejandro Torres. He remembered the way that businessman, whom everyone treated with distant respect, had looked at his daughter with that quiet affection that needs no translation. Raphael had kept the discreet business card that Don Alejandro left at the reception desk in case any family member ever needed a favor. It was not a habit to use such cards, nor was it a habit to act as if nothing were wrong when your heart told you otherwise. Eleanor asked for a glass of water, and the nurse brought it to her with a straw. She took 2 slow sips. She looked at the window. The noise of the city seemed like a distant song. The door opened, and an aide entered with a tray. He brought a light broth and some bread. Eleanor thanked him. She barely tasted it and rested her hand back on her belly. She thought of Madrid, of her father's apartment with the long views of the Castellana, of breakfast with a splash of milk in the coffee on the terrace when the sky was clear. She thought that perhaps that was the place where the air didn't cut through you inside. The doctor returned just in time to ensure that the rest of the day passed without incident. She said that calm was important, and that, if there were visitors, they should be short and kind. She added, with a slight smile, that in Valencia, the best advice is to take things with the measure of a good siesta, and that it's never a bad idea to listen to the elderly, because at a certain age, life teaches you to choose your battles. James did not return immediately. The clock continued its work, and the hospital maintained its discreet rhythm. Raphael was already standing, and then he made a simple decision that for him had the weight of inevitability. He slid his finger across the screen, found a contact he hadn't used in years, and with the same firmness with which he would open an emergency door when there was smoke, he made the call that could restore order where a basic measure of respect had been broken. A father's intercession, Raphael dials a number he had kept for years, the private office of Don Alejandro Torres in Madrid. High up in a glass building on the Paseo de la Castellana, the morning progressed with that midweek rhythm of Madrid, when cars stop and start to the beat of traffic lights, and the murmur of the city seeps through the windows. Don Alejandro Torres's office maintained a light filtered by clear curtains, and on the mahogany desk, perfectly ordered folders were aligned next to an Italian coffee maker that let out a dense, comforting aroma. Alejandro was reviewing construction reports with the attention of someone who had built an empire brick by brick, when his private phone emitted a deep tone that interrupted his concentration. Only a few people had that number. He lifted the receiver, and the firm voice of Rafael Campos Ruiz, the security guard at the Valencia General University Hospital, filled the silence. With the precision of someone who knows that every word counts, Rafael recounted what had happened that morning. He spoke of the hallway, of the argument that grew heated, of that instant when the air turned cold, of how Eleanor had brought her hand to her face and belly, and of the paralyzed faces. He did not exaggerate, but he also did not soften what had occurred. Alejandro listened in silence, leaning back in his chair, his gaze fixed on an indefinite point. Memory brought him the image of his late wife, Doña Cristina, warning him years ago that James had a difficult temperament. He had wanted to believe that time would smooth it out, that marriage and fatherhood would bring calm. Now that hope crumbled with every phrase from Raphael. At the end of the story, the guard hesitated for a second, before adding that it wasn't the first time he had seen signs of tension in the couple. He didn't want to go into details he couldn't confirm, but he felt that Alejandro needed to know. The businessman thanked him for the call with a grave tone, promising that he would not forget his loyalty and courage. He hung up slowly, placed the receiver on the base, and remained for a few seconds with his hand resting on it, as if it still weighed something. He took a deep breath and pressed the intercom to call Patricia Soto Herrera, his head of legal affairs. The lawyer appeared a few minutes later, a folder under her arm and a determined stride. Alejandro told her to close the door and invited her to sit down. Without beating around the bush, he explained what had happened in Valencia, omitting embellishments, with the functional coldness of someone who turns a wound into a work order. Patricia frowned, took quick notes, and asked what he wanted to be done. Alejandro, without looking away from the window, replied that from that moment on, the priority was to protect Eleanor and the grandchild, who was on the way. As they spoke, the bell of a tram could be heard in the street, and the murmur of a group of tourists walking toward the Natural Science Museum. Patricia suggested traveling to Valencia to accompany Eleanor, and, at the same time, observe James up close. Alejandro nodded, but added that her presence would not be to observe but to act. He ordered that they begin to review all contracts and financial ties between Torres Constructions and Velez Promotions, his son-in-law's company. He wanted to know every last detail of how the two companies were connected and if there were any cracks through which to cut. The lawyer, aware of the magnitude of the task, closed the folder and promised to have a preliminary report before nightfall. Alejandro stood up, poured 2 coffees with a splash of milk, and held out a cup. It was a small gesture, but in his world, it meant that alliances were sealed with both data and humanity. As soon as Patricia left, Alejandro dialed another number. This time he spoke to his personal assistant to reorganize his schedule. He canceled 2 meetings, delegated a site visit, and asked for a reservation on the first high-speed train to Valencia for that very afternoon. He wanted to arrive without warning, to see Eleanor before James could mold the story to his convenience. While he waited for confirmation of the trip, he approached the large window. Madrid stretched out before him, with red rooftops and long avenues. He was not a man given to nostalgia, but that morning he allowed himself to remember Eleanor as a child, running through the hallways of his house with a drawing notebook in her hand. He remembered how he had promised, in silence, that nothing would harm her joy. A promise, he understood, is not broken with words, but with omissions. The sound of the phone again interrupted his thoughts. It was Patricia, confirming that Dr. Marcus Cole, the private investigator they had worked with on other occasions, was available to join the trip. Alejandro accepted without a doubt. Marcus had a reputation for being discreet and effective, and in situations like this, information was worth as much as any contract. The businessman allowed himself a sip of coffee, feeling the warmth and bitterness that anchored him to the present. He put an empty folder in his briefcase that he would soon fill with the documents needed to make decisions. His assistant came in to tell him the car would be ready in 20 minutes, enough time to get to Atocha calmly. Before leaving, Alejandro looked at the framed photo of Doña Cristina that he kept on a shelf. It was not a habitual gesture, but that day he felt he owed her a word. He murmured something barely audible, a mix of recognition and apology, and closed the office door. In the elevator, he mentally reviewed the steps he would take in Valencia. He knew that the encounter with Eleanor had to be serene, that before any legal action he had to assure her that she was not alone. The hard decisions would come later, when she was safe under his roof. The car drove through the center of Madrid, skirting the Plaza de Cibeles, and Alejandro observed the comings and goings of people. He thought that every life holds its own invisible battles. At that moment, his was to give his daughter back the peace she deserved. Upon arriving at Atocha, he boarded the train with a determined step. He found his seat by the window, placed his briefcase, and let the initial rattling set a different rhythm. As the city was left behind, and the Castilian landscape opened up into horizons of fields and small villages, Alejandro felt that the distance to Valencia was not only geographical. He was also crossing an emotional territory in which business authority gave way to a father's instinct. A brief message appeared on his phone. It was for Eleanor. It didn't need many words, just enough for her to know that he was already on his way. He typed slowly, reviewing each letter before sending it. "My dear, I'm coming for you. Dad." Then he put his phone in his pocket and let the train continue its course, taking him toward a reunion that would change more than one life, a daughter's return. Eleanor, sitting in a private hospital room, heard determined footsteps approaching down the hallway. The midday light came obliquely through the high window and warmed the white of the walls with a golden tone that made the disinfectant smell more pleasant. In the distance, like an organized heartbeat, firecrackers exploded, announcing the mascleta, and each burst seemed to remind everyone that the city was celebrating, even though inside, time ran at a different pace. Dr. Patricia Morales Lopez had left a pitcher of water and a note with simple recommendations on the bedside table, and was now reviewing the monitor's record, with the practice of someone who knows that serenity also heals. Eleanor looked sideways at her phone in silence. The message she had received shortly before from Madrid still glowed on the screen, brief and clear as a comforting blanket. "My dear, I'm coming for you. Dad." The footsteps stopped at the door. A light knock, then the doorknob turned, and the tall figure of Don Alejandro Torres filled the threshold with a gesture that was as sober as it was warm. He didn't say anything at first. He approached slowly, caressed her forehead with an open hand, and, without asking permission, wrapped her in an embrace that was not solemn or theatrical, but simply human. Eleanor noticed that the air entered her lungs better, a long exhalation, her back giving way, her body recognizing a safe place. The doctor, a half-meter away, nodded to the newcomer, and after introducing herself, explained in a professional tone that the baby was fine, but that the scare had raised her blood pressure, and it was advisable to remain calm and avoid arguments. She said that the afternoon would be for observation, and that, if all continued to be well, they could be discharged soon. Alejandro listened without interrupting, thanked her with few words, and asked for concrete instructions for the next day. Patricia spoke of rest, light meals, short walks at cool hours, and, above all, tranquility. From the street, a sweet aroma rose, a mix of freshly fried buñuelos and hot chocolate, that smell that in Valencia seems to climb the stairs and enter the rooms like a polite guest. Alejandro noticed it and smiled slightly, because memory is also fed by those things, of old snacks and afternoons when Eleanor was a little girl who jumped between chairs. He sat at the foot of the bed and looked at her with the attention of a father who makes decisions. He spoke without raising his voice. He said that he had come to stay for as long as necessary, that he had no more important appointment than her well-being. He added that the Madrid house was ready to receive her, that on the Castellana no one would disturb her rest, and that discretion would be absolute. He proposed that, as soon as the doctor authorized it, they traveled together. Eleanor listened to him with the gratitude of someone who receives a pre-planned solution when they don't have the strength to invent one themselves. But the gratitude was accompanied by a small and persistent doubt. She asked about James. It was not an excuse. It was an honest question. She feared his reaction. She feared the parade of calls and urgent messages. She feared the way he had so often managed to twist the narrative. Alejandro did not engage in insults. He said that for now, the only thing that mattered was her health, and that any conversation with third parties would happen when she was strong and calm. The doctor intervened with that discreet authority that is earned by caring. She explained that shocks at this stage of pregnancy were not advisable, that they had to protect her nightly rest, and that the body understands care. She reminded them of the hospital's lunchtime. She suggested a broth and some bread, and she dropped, as if in passing, that sometimes a brief book and a short nap do more for recovery than many well-intentioned phrases. Alejandro nodded. He thanked her again and asked if he could take care of the discharge procedures as soon as her vital signs normalized. The answer was affirmative, provided that the next few hours were stable. In the hallway, an aide pushed the door with his knuckles and entered with a metal tray. He left the steaming broth and a small plate with a yogurt. Eleanor took 2 spoonfuls and felt that her stomach accepted it. Alejandro, who rarely showed haste in public, had already put his silent agenda in motion. He sent a message to his assistant to coordinate a car at the hospital's side entrance. He asked his butler in Madrid to air out the east-facing room, requested soft cotton sheets and a rocking chair by the window. Everything was done with that economy of movement that distinguishes those who solve things without a fuss. Then he returned to the chair and left his phone on the table, face down, like someone clearing the field of what matters. He took his daughter's hand in both of his, without squeezing it, and then, for the first time, he asked her how she really felt. Eleanor spoke little. She said she felt tired, and at the same time, strangely lucid. She said she didn't want to fight, that she didn't want to justify anything, that she wanted to get to a place where she could sleep soundly. Alejandro clung to the exactness of those desires. The hands of the clock advanced toward 1 o'clock. The murmur of the mascleta grew until it became a strong presence, like a backdrop that vibrated in the glass. The doctor returned for a new measurement. The numbers were going down, and the monitor's line drew a more serene landscape. They talked about logistics naturally. Alejandro proposed the high-speed train for the next day. First thing, silent car, window seat. The doctor approved the idea and suggested that she travel in comfortable clothes, with slip-on shoes and a bag with only the essentials. She also asked that, upon arriving in Madrid, there be silence and a light, home-cooked meal. At that point, Eleanor looked at her father with a mixture of relief and melancholy. She knew that that decision brought with it more than just a change of city. It was a symbolic return, a declaration, a new distribution of loyalties that put her where she should have been from the beginning. Alejandro understood that mix. He was not a man of speeches, but he chose simple words. He told her that at his house no one would ask for explanations, that she would set the pace, that her only task would be to take care of herself and prepare for the baby's arrival. He reminded her, almost in a whisper, that Doña Cristina had always trusted her strength. That mention, without drama, sealed something in the air. Eleanor took a deep breath, and the decision that had been maturing finally found its form. She pronounced it with a clear voice, without trembling, as one announces endings that are at the same time beginnings. A new direction. "It's okay, Dad. I'll go with you," Eleanor pronounced. The phrase fell into the room with a softness that did not exclude firmness. The doctor smiled with her eyes and noted on her control sheet that the patient showed a good state of mind. Alejandro inclined his head, kissed his daughter's forehead, and stood up to take care of the practical part. That backstage of calls and signatures that he turned into a clear corridor. Eleanor lay back a little more, adjusted the pillow, and allowed the exhaustion, at last, to have a place to rest. Light and festive powder echoes continued to come through the window. She thought of the room on the Castellana, of the curtain that filtered the morning sun, of the distant murmur of traffic that sometimes gets confused with the wind. She imagined the rocking chair by the window and a cup of clear tea in her hand. She imagined that when the baby was born, the days would have the gentle texture of the ordinary. The doctor left, promising to return later, and the aide quietly collected the tray. Alejandro, from the hallway, spoke with administration. He asked for discretion for their departure. He explained that they would use the side door to avoid being seen. He confirmed that, if all continued to be well, they could leave at nightfall or first thing the next morning. A soft knock interrupted that planning. It was not the knock of someone who enters without thinking. It was the soft tap of someone preparing a scene. Eleanor turned her head toward the door and, without getting up, guessed the shadow. The heartbeat of the street continued its festive music, and the sweet aroma of chocolate suddenly seemed too cloying. Outside the room, James arrived with a bouquet of white roses and a rehearsed smile. In the hospital hallway, the murmur of voices mixed with the echo of hurried steps and the smell of disinfectant. When the door to the room opened, the figure of James Torres appeared, holding a bouquet of white roses. He smiled with a calculated gesture, too perfect for the occasion, and advanced with the security of someone who is used to their entrance changing the atmosphere. Eleanor saw him from the bed, and her breathing tensed. Alejandro stood up from the chair and observed him with a serenity that contrasted with the newcomer's arrogance. Dr. Patricia remained in a corner, reviewing some reports, and looked up as she noticed the change in the emotional temperature of the room. James placed the flowers on the table with a slow, deliberate movement, as if the scene were a play. He looked at Eleanor, feigning tenderness, and told her that he had run as soon as he found out, that it had all been a misunderstanding, and that together they could resolve it. His words seemed soft, but in their tone was a command disguised as affection. Eleanor, still convalescing, felt the contradiction. A part of her remembered the days when James seemed to be everything she needed, but another, more recent and clearer part, could not ignore the nights of arguments and the feeling of living under surveillance. Alejandro did not intervene immediately. He observed, giving his daughter space to respond, although every muscle in his face was attentive to protecting her. The doctor, aware of her role, remained calm and reminded them that the patient needed rest. She suggested that the visit be brief and that they keep their voices low, so as not to alter the baby's heart rate. James turned to her and condescended with a, "Of course, doctor," although a flash of impatience gleamed in his eyes. The atmosphere filled with a tension that could not be disguised with flowers or rehearsed smiles. From the window came the distant music of the phallus, trumpets and drums that reminded everyone that in the city the party continued, regardless of private battles. Alejandro then decided to intervene. With a serene tone, he thanked James for the flowers and his concern, but clarified that at that moment, the priority was Eleanor's tranquility. He said that any conversation about the future should be held in a neutral place when she was recovered and without pressure. James smiled with his lips, but not with his eyes. He commented that the press was already speculating about their relationship, and that the best thing was to show a united front to avoid rumors. That reference to the outside world made Alejandro tense up. He reminded him that health is not measured in headlines, but in heartbeats and rest. The doctor corroborated his words with medical data and added that any alteration could have undesirable consequences. Eleanor listened in silence, but a determination was forming within her. She did not want her life or her son's to be negotiated based on headlines or appearances. The clock marked mid-afternoon. In the street, fireworks exploded, making the windows vibrate. Alejandro took his daughter's hand and asked her to think only about what made her feel safe. James took one more step closer, with a gesture of possession disguised as tenderness, and insisted that he was the man who should be by her side at that moment. Eleanor, with a voice firmer than she expected, replied that what she needed now was peace, not speeches. That phrase cut the room in two. Alejandro took the opportunity to indicate that the visit had to end. James resisted for an instant, then picked up his jacket with a brusque gesture and turned toward the door. Before leaving, he said in a low voice that this was not over, that there were still many things to discuss. The silence that followed was dense. Eleanor closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if she wanted to expel the weight of that presence. The doctor approached and checked her vitals, which had risen slightly during the visit. She advised a moment of uninterrupted rest and promised to reinforce the instructions at the reception desk to limit access. Alejandro remained seated by her side, in silence, until he noticed that his daughter's breathing was becoming regular again. Then he went out into the hallway to make a call. His low but firm voice ordered that a transfer be arranged for the next morning. He didn't want any more shocks. He preferred that Eleanor and the baby be in Madrid in a controlled and discreet environment. In the meantime, he also asked his assistant to contact a trusted lawyer. He was not seeking immediate conflict, but he knew it was prudent to prepare. Back in the room, he found Eleanor asleep, with the bouquet of flowers on the table, still perfuming the air. Alejandro looked at it, and, with a slow gesture, moved it to the hallway, leaving it in a corner where it would soon go unnoticed. He sat down again and thought about everything that had been broken in his daughter's life. He remembered his late wife, Doña Cristina, and how she would have handled that moment with sweetness and firmness. He decided that that memory would be his guide. It was not about revenge or public battles. It was about accompanying Eleanor to a place where she could start over. The hours advanced, and the noise of the city waned. At some point during the night, father and daughter shared a brief exchange of words before sleeping. She thanked him for being there, and he promised her that, no matter what, she would never feel alone again. The next morning, it dawned clear. The intense blue sky of Valencia showed the colored garlands that still hung in the streets after the night of celebration. The hospital resumed its routine, and Dr. Morales confirmed that Eleanor was fit to travel. Alejandro organized the trip with the precision of a clockmaker. Everything was planned: a discreet car, the high-speed train ticket, a minimal, trusted escort. Eleanor put on comfortable clothes and packed a few things in a bag. As she left through the side door of the hospital, she felt a mix of relief and fear for what was still pending. Alejandro accompanied her with a firm step. In his eyes there was determination, but also the shadow of concern for the words that James had left hanging in the air. As the car drove away from the hospital, Eleanor rested her forehead against the glass and watched as the palm trees and buildings were left behind. She thought of Madrid, of the house on the Castellana, of the rocking chair by the window, and of the possibility of starting over. Alejandro, by her side, closed his eyes for an instant and prayed in silence for the peace to last. But he knew that the most difficult battle had not yet begun. That certainty became the secret he kept as he caressed his daughter's hand. The afternoon was calm, but somewhere James was planning his next move, convinced that he could still reclaim what he believed was his. Alejandro's determination and Eleanor's fragility came together on the same horizon. The journey was just beginning, and with it, the definitive test of how far a father can go to protect what he loves most. A new life, a new battle. The Madrid afternoon fell over the Paseo de la Castellana, with an orange sky that illuminated the classic buildings and the constant traffic. In the home of Alejandro Torres, the atmosphere was different from the hustle and bustle of the city. The lit fireplace provided a serene warmth, and on the dining room table, there were simple dishes, tortilla de patatas, and fresh salad. Eleanor, sitting next to her father, seemed calmer for the first time since what happened in Valencia. Her pregnancy was progressing normally, and Dr. Morales, who had agreed to stay in Madrid for a few days, supervised every detail of her recovery. It was a familiar, intimate scene, which contrasted with the tension of the previous days. Alejandro, however, knew that the calm was relative. James's visit to the hospital had not been a closed chapter, but the prelude to new attempts. While they shared dinner, Alejandro spoke of the need to reinforce the security of the house. He did not do so in an alarming tone, but practically, like someone preparing for a trip. Eleanor listened in silence, with mixed feelings. On the one hand, she appreciated the protection. On the other, she did not want to feel like a prisoner in her own home. Patricia intervened gently, reminding them that the most important thing was emotional serenity. She said that a safe environment is built not only with locks, but also with trust. Alejandro nodded and promised himself not to fall into obsession. His daughter should not live in fear, but with hope. After dinner, Eleanor retired to her room, and Alejandro was left alone in the living room. He turned on the radio and let the notes of an old zarzuela fill the space. He closed his eyes and thought about the future. He wondered if he would be able to guide his daughter toward a new life without repeating the mistakes of the past, those silences that had once allowed his marriage to Doña Cristina to grow cold. The next day, a routine took shape. Eleanor ate breakfast of bread with tomato and café con leche on the terrace. Patricia took advantage of the mornings to take small walks with her through the gardens of the house. Alejandro, meanwhile, received reports in his office, reviewed legal documents, and talked with his trusted lawyer, Don Manuel Rivas. The strategy had to be clear: ensure that any claim by James lacked a basis. To do this, Manuel needed to gather evidence of James's previous behavior, his shady business dealings, and his history of excesses. Alejandro was determined to act legally and transparently. He did not want clandestine revenge, just justice. Manuel warned him that James was cunning and would probably try to approach Eleanor through indirect means, through mutual acquaintances, or even the press. Alejandro took a deep breath. He knew that the Torres last name was a magnet for journalists, but he set out to protect his daughter's privacy. The first test came faster than expected. One morning, as they were leaving a medical checkup, a photographer tried to get close to capture images of Eleanor. Alejandro reacted immediately. He ordered his driver to get them away and asked for discretion from the clinic. Eleanor, frightened, understood that her life had changed. She could no longer walk peacefully through the streets of Madrid without fear of being watched. That night, as they were having dinner in the dining room, Alejandro took her hand and told her that the most important thing was to protect her privacy. He promised that as long as he lived, no one would use her as a media trophy. Eleanor smiled with gratitude, although a trace of melancholy could be seen in her eyes. She wanted to feel free again, not become a symbol of a dispute. At the same time, Patricia became more and more integrated into the family dynamic. Her presence was not only medical, but also human. She prepared chamomile infusions, recommended gentle walks, and sometimes shared stories of her own personal challenges. Eleanor began to confide in her, sharing thoughts that she did not dare to tell her father. She told her about the moments of tenderness that James had also had, how not everything had been darkness. Patricia listened without judgment and reminded her that recognizing the complexity of a person does not justify the harm. That conversation marked a change in Eleanor. She understood that she could remember the past without being trapped in it. Alejandro observed that evolution from a distance. He was happy to see his daughter less somber, although sometimes it hurt him that she shared confidences with someone else and not with him. Weeks passed, and the house became a refuge. Alejandro began to rediscover the value of small gestures. He prepared breakfasts. He read the newspaper aloud for his daughter and was surprised to enjoy simple conversations. The relationship between father and daughter was being repaired like an old fabric sewn with patience. One Sunday, in the middle of a quiet after-dinner conversation, Alejandro confessed that he sometimes felt that life was offering him a second chance to be the father he hadn't always known how to be. Eleanor was moved and told him that despite everything, she had always felt his love, even in the silences. That exchange united them in a new, more mature way. It was not just a protective relationship. It was that of two adults who recognized each other in their fragilities. However, James's shadow was still present. One afternoon, Alejandro received an anonymous call that hinted at a possible legal move. There were no concrete details, just a warning. He hasn't given up. Alejandro hung up the phone with the serenity of someone who had expected it, but unease settled in his chest. He decided not to tell Eleanor immediately, so as not to worry her. That night, he could barely sleep. He walked through the hallways of the house and stopped in front of the portrait of his deceased wife. He murmured a prayer asking for strength. At dawn, with dark circles under his eyes, he went out into the garden and breathed the fresh Madrid air. He swore in silence that he would not allow anyone to break the peace his daughter was beginning to rebuild. Fate, however, had a different test prepared. Days later, during a routine visit to the clinic, they unexpectedly ran into a journalist known to the family. It was Laura Mendez, a veteran reporter who had followed business news for years. Laura greeted them with respect, but her gaze fell on Eleanor with evident curiosity. Alejandro intervened quickly, explaining that they would not give statements and that everything should be kept in the private sphere. Laura accepted, although she let slip that the newspaper was interested in knowing the true story. That phrase was left hanging in the air. Alejandro understood that discretion was fragile and that public opinion could become a ruthless judge. He decided that the best defense was transparency. He agreed with Manuel, the lawyer, to prepare an official statement that would emphasize Eleanor's privacy and health as an absolute priority. The writing of the statement became a symbolic act. Alejandro wrote it with his own hand, with simple words and without embellishments. He said that the family was going through a delicate time and asked for respect. When Eleanor read it, she was moved. She recognized in that text not only the voice of the calculating businessman, but also that of the sensitive father who defended his intimate space. That night, while the radio played old boleros in the living room, Eleanor approached her father and gave him a long hug. Alejandro felt that that gesture was more powerful than any public statement. The chapter closed with a serene scene. On the terrace, illuminated by the city lights, father and daughter shared a comfortable silence. The wind brought the aromas of jasmine from the nearby gardens. Alejandro thought that, although the road back to the house was full of obstacles, he had found the true reward in those simple moments. However, deep down, he had a premonition that James would soon make another move. That certainty became the shadow that accompanied even the sweetest moments. While the Madrid night enveloped the house, the Torres family discovered that true strength is not measured in business or titles, but in the ability to resist together in the face of the inevitable. The final judgment. A fine rain fell on the rooftops of Madrid, while the Torres family tried to regain a certain routine in the house on the Castellana. Eleanor had become accustomed to having breakfast on the glassed-in terrace, where the aroma of freshly made coffee mixed with the humidity of the garden. Her pregnancy was advancing calmly, and Dr. Patricia Morales continued to supervise every detail. Alejandro watched with a mixture of pride and fear as his daughter slowly regained her serenity. However, the threat of James continued to float in the air like an echo that no one wanted to name aloud. The memory of the anonymous call he had received still kept him awake some nights, wondering how the next move would arrive. One ordinary morning, as Eleanor was returning from a gentle walk accompanied by Patricia, she found a white envelope at the entrance to the house. It had no return address, but the seal of a law office in Valencia was unmistakable. Alejandro opened it cautiously, and inside he found a formal notification. James was claiming his marital rights and demanding financial compensation linked to the Torres last name. The language of the document was cold, calculated, and in every line, the shadow of a legal battle could be felt. Eleanor was filled with fear. She had done everything possible to distance herself from that past, and yet he kept finding a way to intrude into her life. Alejandro, on the other hand, showed no surprise. With a firm voice, he assured her that the next step was to respond with clarity and demonstrate that the family would not be intimidated. The following days were marked by constant meetings with Manuel Rivas, the family's trusted lawyer. The office became a center for legal discussions and strategies. Eleanor listened attentively, although she found it difficult to follow the legal terms. For her, the important thing was the feeling of being under James's control again. In one of those meetings, Patricia spoke up. She reminded them that the essential thing was Eleanor's health and that they should not let the external pressure affect her pregnancy. Alejandro thanked her for her words and promised that everything would be resolved without his daughter having to be exposed to humiliating situations. It was the first time in a long time that he was so sure of himself. He had regained the energy of the days when he firmly led his business empire, although now the motivation was different. It was not about business, but about his daughter's dignity. Eleanor, meanwhile, was experiencing a whirlwind of emotions. One afternoon, she took refuge in the house library. She sat in front of the large windows that overlooked the garden and wrote down thoughts in a notebook that she didn't dare to share aloud. She remembered moments of her relationship with James, from the excitement of the first months to the pain of disappointment. At times she felt rage, at times nostalgia. She didn't understand how she had allowed someone like that to have so much power over her. Patricia found her in that state and sat down beside her. She told her that writing is a way of healing, that recognizing pain is the first step to freeing yourself from it. Eleanor smiled with tears in her eyes. She understood that her path to peace was not just about winning a lawsuit, but about regaining her self-confidence. The legal process advanced slowly, with documents going back and forth between offices in Madrid and Valencia. Alejandro made an effort to remain calm in front of his daughter, but in private, he was restless. One night, as he walked through the dimly lit living room, Patricia joined him in silence. Alejandro confessed that he feared he wouldn't have the strength to sustain all this. She reminded him that true strength is not in avoiding problems, but in facing them with dignity. Her words moved him more than he expected. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him with such frankness. Alejandro realized that he was not alone, that he had found in Patricia an ally not only for his daughter's health, but also for his own emotional balance. The tension reached a climax when James appeared in person in Madrid. He did not do so in an aggressive way, but subtly. He showed up at the restaurant where Alejandro usually had lunch with some old colleagues. When he saw him, Alejandro felt a knot in his stomach. James, in an impeccable suit and with a calculated smile, approached his table and told him that sooner or later they would end up resolving everything in front of a judge. His words were not a direct attack, but a reminder that he was willing to go all the way. Alejandro looked him in the eye and calmly replied that the Torres family would not be manipulated. That brief exchange, in the midst of the restaurant's hustle and bustle, marked a before and after. The war was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. That night, back home, Alejandro decided to tell Eleanor what had happened. He did not want to hide the truth, although he knew it could worry her. Eleanor listened in silence and, surprisingly, showed serenity. She said that if James wanted to drag them into a lawsuit, then she was willing to face him. Alejandro looked at her with both pride and concern. He recognized in his daughter a courage that had been hidden until then. It was the beginning of a new stage. It was not just about defending herself, but about regaining the voice that James had taken from her for years. The atmosphere in the house changed after that conversation. Eleanor began to participate more actively in the meetings with Manuel. She asked questions, requested explanations, and wanted to understand every step. Alejandro watched with emotion as his daughter transformed, how the woman who once took refuge in silence now spoke with conviction. Patricia supported her in every decision, celebrating the small advances and reminding her that strength does not exclude vulnerability. It was a slow but constant process, like water that erodes stone. In the midst of this transformation, Alejandro allowed himself a moment of respite. One afternoon, he took Eleanor and Patricia for a walk in the Retiro. They bought roasted chestnuts from a stand and sat near the pond. The fresh air and the laughter of the children running around returned the illusion of normalcy for a few hours. Eleanor felt free, even though she knew that the legal battle was still to be fought. Alejandro, for his part, discovered that those simple moments were what truly gave meaning to life. It was not money or prestige, but the sincere company of those who stay during difficult times. When they returned to the house, they found a new envelope in the mailbox. This time there were no logos or recognizable signatures, just a handwritten phrase. "This is not over." Alejandro read it in silence and put it in his pocket. He did not say anything to his daughter at that moment. He decided to wait, although deep down he understood that the calm was only a mirage. The conflict was far from resolved, and the next few weeks would test everything they had rebuilt. As he turned off the lights in the living room and went up to his room, Alejandro thought that the real challenge would not be to win a lawsuit, but to keep his daughter's hope intact in the midst of the storm. The final showdown. The city of Madrid awoke with a strange air of expectation. News of the lawsuit between the Torres family and James began to circulate in some discreet circles, and although Alejandro had tried to keep everything quiet, nothing could stop people's curiosity. In the house on the Castellana, breakfasts had become strategic meetings. Manuel Rivas arrived early with folders full of documents and explained the steps they would take in the Valencia courthouse. Eleanor, with her advanced pregnancy, tried to remain serene, although every word about deadlines and judges reminded her that she would soon have to publicly face her past. Patricia, always close by, watched over her health and repeated that the essential thing was not to let anxiety dominate her mood. However, the true source of the tension was in Alejandro, who every day felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. One autumn afternoon, the group traveled to Valencia for a preliminary hearing. Atocha station was crowded, and among the hustle and bustle of travelers, Alejandro felt watched. During the train ride, he looked out the window with a grave expression, remembering the days when he himself had been an inflexible man, so similar in some ways to James. It was a thought that made him uncomfortable, but which he could not shake. Eleanor, sitting next to him, gently stroked her belly, as if seeking strength from the child on the way. Patricia offered them a calm smile, trying to dispel the tension. The trip, although brief, became a compendium of dense silences and gazes loaded with doubt. Upon arriving in Valencia, the family stayed in a small hotel near the City of Arts and Sciences. From the window of his room, Alejandro contemplated the modern forms of the architectural complex, which seemed to contrast with the antiquity of the problems they were carrying. The morning of the preliminary trial dawned with a gray sky and a constant drizzle. Eleanor walked slowly, holding Patricia's arm, toward the courthouse building. Around them, The murmur of passers-by was inevitable. Some recognized Alejandro, others noticed Eleanor, and there were those who whispered James's name, with a mixture of contempt and morbid curiosity. For Eleanor, it was like walking naked in front of strangers, but she remained upright, aware that running away would only fuel the rumors. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was solemn. The wooden benches, the portraits of retired judges, and the silence broken only by the echo of footsteps gave the feeling of being in a place where decisions weighed more than anywhere else. Manuel spoke on behalf of the family, firmly presenting Eleanor's rights and the abusive nature of James's demands. When it was his turn to speak, James appeared with his usual confidence. He wore an impeccable dark suit and smiled as if every gesture was calculated. In his arguments, he tried to portray Eleanor as a capricious and ungrateful woman, someone who owed him part of her financial stability. It was a moment of great tension, and Alejandro clenched his fists under the table to restrain himself. Patricia, from the observer's seat, fixed her gaze on Eleanor, transmitting calm with her simple presence. The climax of the day came when the judge asked Eleanor to speak. It was not planned, and the young woman's heart pounded with uncontrolled force. She stood up slowly, her hand on her belly, and addressed the court. Her voice, although trembling at first, gained strength as she narrated her story. She told how she had been a victim of James's control, how his promises had been transformed into chains, and how she had fought to rebuild herself far from him. It was not about money or last names, but about dignity and the future of her child. There was an instant when the room was in absolute silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of those present. Even the judge seemed surprised by the strength of her words. Alejandro, moved, felt for the first time that his daughter no longer needed protection, but recognition as a full and brave woman. When the session ended, James left first, accompanied by his lawyers, with a forced smile. Alejandro watched him as he passed close by and understood that behind that facade there was contained anger. James was no longer invincible, and he knew it. Eleanor, exhausted, allowed herself to be embraced by Patricia, who whispered that she had taken a decisive step toward her freedom. Manuel, with a serious but satisfied expression, said that the testimony had been convincing and that they had more chances than they imagined. For Alejandro, that day represented an internal turning point. He realized that his role was no longer to solve everything for her, but to accompany her and trust in her ability. That recognition hurt, and at the same time relieved him. It was like accepting that his daughter was no longer a child, but a woman capable of writing her own story. That night at the hotel, Eleanor could not sleep. She went out onto the balcony and contemplated the lights of Valencia reflecting in the Turia River. Alejandro joined her a few minutes later. They didn't talk much. They just shared the silence and the cool breeze. In that instant, Alejandro remembered the years when he had neglected his family for work and promised himself not to repeat that mistake. Eleanor, without looking at him, thanked him for having been there, but also told him gently that she would take the next step herself. Alejandro smiled with a quiet pride. He had waited a long time to hear those words. The following days were marked by headlines in some local newspapers. The Torres heiress faces her ex-husband in Valencia court. The comments varied, but between the lines, a new respect for Eleanor could be seen. In the Madrid house, upon returning, the routine seemed lighter, although the threat was still present. Patricia organized a small dinner with close friends to celebrate Eleanor's courage. They served paella and toasted with red wine from La Rioja. Amidst laughter and conversations, Eleanor allowed herself to enjoy for the first time in months. However, at the end of the evening, she found an unknown message on her phone. "You have no idea what's coming." It was James's voice, though disguised in words. The shock was inevitable, and she felt the cold on her back again. Alejandro received the news with contained anger, but decided not to respond immediately. Manuel advised him to save that message as evidence, and Patricia insisted that the important thing was to keep Eleanor calm. The night concluded with an ambivalent feeling. They had gained moral strength, but James's shadow still extended over them. As he went to bed, Alejandro understood that the legal battle would not be the only field of struggle. James, with his obsession, would look for cracks in the family's life. The real challenge was just beginning, and the next chapter would test not only Eleanor's resilience, but also the unity of everyone around her. A New Horizon winter had arrived with its cold air to Madrid, and the streets of the Salamanca neighborhood were adorned with Christmas lights that hung from the balconies and were reflected in the shop windows. However, in Alejandro's house, there was no trace of celebration. The accumulated tension after the hearing in Valencia and the threatening messages from James kept everyone in a constant state of alert. Eleanor, closer and closer to giving birth, tried to show serenity, but fear silently hit her during the nights. Alejandro, aware of this danger, had reinforced the security of the house and held frequent meetings with Manuel to plan the legal strategy. Patricia, for her part, did everything possible to take care of Eleanor, preparing her chamomile infusions and telling her anecdotes from everyday life to distract her from the weight she carried in her heart. One afternoon, while they were sharing coffee in a living room in the Plaza Mayor, Manuel informed them that James had tried to use his influence with former business and political contacts. Although he no longer had the strength of yesteryear, he was still a dangerous man. Alejandro listened with a frown, feeling that each new revelation was another stone on his conscience. He had sworn to protect his daughter and his future grandson, but he understood that there were limits that did not depend only on his will. Eleanor intervened with a firm voice, assuring them that she was not willing to back down. She wanted her child to be born in an environment where fear did not reign, and for that, she had to face every shadow of the past. Those words surprised everyone, as they spoke of a maturity and a strength that Eleanor had built step by step since her escape from James. The days passed slowly, with meetings of lawyers, phone calls, and visits to notaries. One morning, they received an official summons. The definitive trial would be held in 2 months. The announcement fell like a thunderclap. Alejandro felt a mixture of relief and fear, because finally, there would be a resolution, but also because he knew that James would try to deliver his final blow for accepting defeat. Eleanor, upon receiving the news, remained silent, looking out the dining room window, where the bare trees let a glimpse of the grayness of the winter sky. Patricia took her hand and told her that she was not alone. That simple gesture had an immediate effect, like a reminder that the family was united, even in the darkest moments. One rainy afternoon, Alejandro went to visit an old friend in Toledo, a priest with whom he had shared his youth. He needed advice. In the dim light of the sacristy, he confessed his doubts, his guilt for having been a cold man in the past, and his fears about not being able to protect his loved ones. The priest replied that life always offers the possibility of redemption, but that redemption is not measured in legal victories or in punishing the enemy, but in the ability to love and to remain firm in the truth. Alejandro returned to Madrid with a heart a little lighter, determined to accompany Eleanor with more patience and to trust more in the strength she had shown. Meanwhile, James did not remain still. Rumors began to circulate in some sensationalist newspapers. Columns hinted that Eleanor was seeking to enrich herself at the expense of a broken marriage, or that Alejandro was using his influence to manipulate justice. They were unfounded accusations, but the mere fact of appearing in print stained the family's reputation. One morning, while having breakfast with churros and hot chocolate in the kitchen, Alejandro threw the newspaper onto the table with a gesture of anger. Eleanor, on the other hand, took a deep breath and said that she would not be intimidated. She had learned that James's true power was his ability to sow fear, and if they didn't allow it, he would lose strength. Her words made Patricia smile, who saw in Eleanor not only a daughter and a friend, but a woman who was taking command of her own life. The climax of those days came at a family meeting held at the house. Manuel had prepared the documents for the final defense and explained every detail. Eleanor listened attentively, taking notes, while Alejandro was losing patience with the amount of technical jargon. Suddenly, Eleanor asked to speak, in a clear voice. She said that she wanted to speak herself at the trial, without hiding behind lawyers or family members. Alejandro's eyes widened in surprise, and Manuel tried to dissuade her, but Eleanor insisted. She needed James to look her in the face and understand that he no longer had control over her. The room fell silent, until Patricia broke the moment by saying that she fully supported that decision. Alejandro, although worried, felt an immense pride and remembered the priest's words, "Redemption is in love and in truth." Perhaps the best gift he could give his daughter was to allow her to face her own voice. The night of that meeting, when everyone left to rest, Eleanor stayed in the living room, illuminated by the Christmas lights that flickered on the balcony. She sat in an armchair with a blanket over her legs and thought about everything that had happened since she left James. She remembered the tears, the loneliness, the fear, but also the freedom, the support of Patricia, the return of her father, and the new life that was growing inside her. She felt strong and grateful. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a cold air caressed the streets. Eleanor smiled for the first time in weeks, convinced that the future could be bright if she maintained the courage to move forward. The next day brought an unexpected turn. While reviewing correspondence in Manuel's office, an envelope without a return address appeared. Inside, there were photos of Eleanor taken without her noticing. In the street, at the doctor's office, entering her usual cafe and lavapiés. The threat was clear. James was watching her. Alejandro gritted his teeth in anger. Patricia paled, and Eleanor, although frightened, calmly said that this only showed her ex-husband's desperation. Manuel suggested taking the evidence to the judge to request additional protection measures. The tension immediately reignited, reminding them that the battle was not only legal, but personal and dangerous. However, the fact that Eleanor did not fall apart, but maintained her composure, marked a difference from months ago. The day concluded with a silent dinner at home. The aroma of tortilla de patatas filled the kitchen, but no one seemed to have much appetite. Alejandro looked at his daughter and saw in her a reflection of the strength he had always admired in his late wife. Patricia took it upon herself to liven up the conversation, telling stories from Eleanor's childhood that brought some smiles. When she left to go to her room, Eleanor said in a low voice that no matter the shadows or the threats, she had already decided her destiny. Those words resonated in Alejandro all night. He understood that the real change was not in the strategies of the courts or in James's intrigues, but in Eleanor's transformation. His daughter was no longer a victim, but the protagonist of her story. The chapter closed with that conviction shared in silence. Outside, Madrid was dressed in lights and carols, and although the Torres family could not fully surrender to the Christmas spirit, there was a sense of hope in the air. They knew that the worst was yet to come, but also that the strength born of family unity and Eleanor's determination would be the key to resisting. On the horizon, the definitive trial loomed, and with it, the possibility of closing old wounds. However, James's shadow would not retreat without a fight, and everyone sensed it. The victory of truth. The dawn in Valencia brought a clear sky, with a winter sun that faintly illuminated the cobblestone streets that surrounded the city of justice. The Torres family arrived early, each with a face marked by tension and hope. Eleanor wore a sober pearl gray suit, her belly very evident under the fabric, but she walked with a firm step. Alejandro, with a serious expression and carefully combed hair, accompanied her closely. Patricia remained by her side, serene but attentive, while Manuel organized the final defense papers. The trial was about to begin, and everything they had built in months depended on those hours. The silence at the entrance to the courthouse was barely broken by the murmur of journalists and onlookers who hoped to witness the outcome of a confrontation that had captured public attention. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. James was already there, sitting with his lawyer, wearing an expensive suit, but with a face hardened by bitterness. When Eleanor entered, he looked up and a spark of anger crossed his eyes. She, on the other hand, remained calm and did not look away. She remembered every word she had promised to say, every moment she had remade her life after so much pain, and now she felt she was in a position to speak her truth. The judge, a middle-aged man with a serious countenance, asked for silence and began the session. Alejandro took a deep breath, while Patricia squeezed his arm discreetly, trying to transmit strength to him. James's lawyer opened with a speech full of accusations. He tried to present Eleanor as a manipulative woman who sought to take advantage of the situation, and Alejandro as a businessman who used his contacts to influence the process. Each word was a blow to the family's patience, but Manuel, prepared, took notes and remained serene. When it was the defense's turn, he clearly presented the facts. The years of psychological abuse and control exercised by James, the documented evidence of threats, and the surveillance to which Eleanor had been subjected. The room murmured at each revelation, while the judge listened attentively. James, nervous, tapped his fingers on the table. The crucial moment came when Eleanor asked to speak. She stood up slowly, instinctively stroking her belly before addressing the stand. Her voice, although trembling at first, gained strength as she told her story. She narrated how she had escaped from a marriage that oppressed her, how she had rebuilt her life from scratch, how she had found in her father and in Patricia a support that restored her confidence. She did not use words of hatred, but of dignity. She looked James directly in the eyes and told him that she was no longer afraid of him, that her child would be born free from the chains of the past. The room fell into a deep silence. Even some of the attendees, who had come as mere onlookers, were moved by her statement. Alejandro felt tears burn in his eyes, and Patricia, moved, lowered her head to hide her emotion. James, enraged, asked to intervene. His lawyer tried to stop him, but he stood up and began to make incoherent accusations. He said that Eleanor had betrayed him, that Alejandro had manipulated everyone, that the press was against him. The judge asked him to calm down several times, but James lost control. His voice echoed in the room, full of resentment, and for a moment he seemed to forget where he was. That loss of composure was watched with attention by the judge and those present. Alejandro clenched his fists, fearing that verbal explosion might escalate, but Manuel reassured him with a gesture. It was clear that James was showing his true colors in front of everyone. After that outburst, the session continued with the presentation of additional evidence. Photographs of the illegal surveillance, medical reports, and testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed scenes of verbal violence reinforced Eleanor's case. The judge announced a recess to deliberate on the admissibility of the evidence, and the room slowly emptied. Alejandro accompanied his daughter to a bench in the hallway, where she sat exhausted, but serene. Patricia handed her a bottle of water and caressed her shoulder. Eleanor, with a slight smile, assured them that no matter how much longer this lasted, she had already said what she had been silent about for years. Alejandro, in silence, promised himself he would never fail her again. The recess ended, and everyone returned to their places. The judge, with a firm gesture, announced that all the evidence presented would be accepted, and that Eleanor's testimony would be considered a key piece. James paled, and his lawyer tried to maintain his composure, but it was clear that the scales were tipping. The day was drawing to a close, and the judge declared that the sentence would be handed down the next day after reviewing all the material again. That decision prolonged the wait, but it also made clear the importance of the case. The Torres family left the courtroom with a slow step, surrounded by cameras and microphones, although Alejandro asked them not to make statements. They wanted to maintain calm at that decisive moment. The climax of the day came at the exit of the courthouse. As they were going down the stairs, James approached, escorted by his lawyer. In a barely contained voice, he whispered to Eleanor that this was not over, that he still had resources. Eleanor looked at him without blinking and replied serenely that she was no longer afraid of him. Alejandro intervened immediately, placing himself between the two, and Manuel made a gesture to the security guards to separate the situation. It was a brief moment, but loaded with symbolism. James no longer had power over her. That firm look from Eleanor said it all. Patricia, observing the scene, felt that her friend had achieved a strength that she herself could not have imagined. Upon returning home, the atmosphere was different. Dinner took place in silence, with bowls of hot soup and freshly baked bread that they barely tasted. Each one was immersed in their thoughts. Alejandro reflected on how close they were to the outcome. Patricia thought about how to support everyone in the final moment, and Eleanor, despite her exhaustion, showed an inner peace that radiated in every gesture. Before retiring to rest, she said in a low voice that regardless of the sentence, she already felt free. Those words echoed, filling the house, reminding them that the trial was only one part of the journey, and that the real battle was fought in the heart. The day closed with a solemn silence. Outside, Valencia was still vibrant with its night lights and the murmur of the city. But inside that house, there was a different kind of calm, like the one that precedes a storm. The family knew that the next day, everything could change forever. Alejandro looked out the window, thoughtfully, while Eleanor slept in peace for the first time in weeks. Fate was about to be written, and no one could foresee what the judge's last word would be. However, everyone sensed that the truth had begun to break through, and that James's shadows were weakening little by little. A triumphant dawn. The morning in Valencia dawned clear, with a limpid sky that announced a serene day after so many emotional storms. The Torres family got up early and had breakfast together in silence, accompanied only by the aroma of coffee and toast. Eleanor absent-mindedly stroked her belly as she listened to Patricia's words of encouragement and Manuel's practical observations about the schedule at the courthouse. Alejandro, serious but composed, simply looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and nervousness. He knew that that day would mark a before and after in their lives, and he hoped that the judge would put an end to the uncertainty that had consumed them for months. The atmosphere in the house was sober, charged with expectation, but also with an air of quiet dignity. At the courthouse, the hustle and bustle was greater than on previous days. Journalists, photographers, and onlookers crowded at the entrance, hoping to capture an image or a statement. The case had attracted public attention, not only because of the names involved, but because it represented a woman's struggle to free herself from the shadows of her past and build a different future for her child. When Eleanor crossed the door of the building, she did so upright, with a firm step, followed closely by her father and Patricia. Alejandro watched her with a lump in his throat, aware that this daughter, whom he had once felt was fragile, now radiated a strength that moved him deeply. The echo of Eleanor's heels on the marble floor of the hallway seemed to mark the beat of the final day. The room was full, and the judge appeared on time, asking for silence with a solemn gesture. James, sitting on the other side with a tense countenance, tried to maintain his composure, although his restless eyes betrayed his anxiety. The defense lawyer reviewed his notes, while the prosecutor adjusted the final documents on his table. The judge announced that he had reviewed all the evidence and testimonies, and that he was in a position to issue his verdict. A reverent silence took over the room. Clocks seemed to stop, and even the breathing of those present was held in wait. Eleanor took her father's hand for an instant, as if to remind him that everything they had lived through together had led them to that moment. The reading of the verdict was slow and clear. The judge declared James guilty of psychological coercion and of violating his ex-partner's privacy through illegal surveillance. In addition, he ruled that Eleanor would maintain full custody of her future child and would have protective measures to guarantee her peace of mind. The sentence included financial sanctions and strict limitations for James regarding his contact with her. The room reacted with an immediate murmur. Some were surprised, others nodded in silence. Alejandro breathed a sigh of relief, feeling a huge weight lift from his shoulders. Patricia moved, let the tears flow freely, and Manuel allowed himself a discreet smile of satisfaction. Eleanor remained serene, although contained emotion shone in her eyes. She had waited for this recognition of justice for too long. James reacted with rage. He stood up abruptly, protesting with hurried phrases about conspiracies and manipulations. The judge interrupted him firmly, reminding him that he had to be respectful in the room. His lawyers surrounded him to calm him, but his figure, once imposing, now seemed small against the weight of the truth. Eleanor looked at him in silence and understood that that man no longer had power over her life. She didn't need to respond or retort. Her freedom did not depend on his words, but on the decision she had just heard. That moment of confrontation was brief but forceful, and everyone in the room felt it as the closing of a painful cycle. The exit from the courthouse was a contrast to the tension inside. Outside, the midday light bathed the square, and journalists launched questions. Alejandro asked the reporters for respect and refused to make extensive statements. Eleanor, however, stopped for a moment and spoke a few simple words. She said that justice did not erase the past, but it opened the door to a future where her child could grow up in peace and surrounded by love. There were no long speeches or prepared phrases, just the sincere voice of a woman who had regained her dignity. The crowd fell silent for a second before erupting in applause. Alejandro, moved, hugged her tightly, while Patricia held her hand. It was an intimate moment shared with everyone, a symbol that wounds, however deep, could heal. Upon returning home, the family decided to share a simple but special meal. On the table, there was tortilla de patatas, freshly baked bread, and a fresh salad. They toasted with red wine from UTL Requena, celebrating the closing of a dark stage. Eleanor ate slowly, savoring each bite, as if she wanted to taste the present. Patricia told small anecdotes to lighten the tension, and Manuel commented on how that trial could become an important precedent. Alejandro watched everyone with a mixture of relief and gratitude, knowing that the most important thing was not the signed papers or the sentences, but the unity they had managed to maintain and strengthen. The afternoon passed calmly. Eleanor, tired, lay down on the sofa while listening to the radio. Outside, the city's hustle and bustle continued, but inside the house, peace reigned. Alejandro approached his daughter and told her that he was proud of her courage. She, with a serene smile, replied that she would not have done it without his support. Father and daughter shared a silence loaded with meaning, wordlessly recognizing the long road they had traveled and the opportunity for a new beginning. Patricia, from the kitchen, watched them tenderly, understanding that she had been a witness to a transformation that went beyond a legal process. As night fell, they went for a walk together through the illuminated streets of Valencia. The city vibrated with its usual life, but for them, every corner seemed different. They passed by a church where bells were ringing and stopped in a small square to sit under the orange trees. The aroma of orange blossoms permeated the air, and the dim lights created a cozy atmosphere. Eleanor, leaning on her father's shoulder, murmured that now she could truly breathe. Alejandro replied that life always gives second chances, and that the important thing was to take advantage of them with gratitude. In that instant, the future opened up before them like a bright horizon. The emotional climax of the day came when Alejandro, in a low voice, confessed to his daughter that he feared losing her many times, but that now he understood that she was stronger than he had ever imagined. Eleanor, with contained tears, told him that she had inherited that strength from him. They hugged for a long time, under the complicit gaze of Patricia and Manuel, who remained nearby in silence. That hug not only symbolized the judicial victory, but also family reconciliation, forgiveness, and the promise of a shared tomorrow. The wound of the past was left behind, and what remained was the certainty that together they could face any adversity. The day ended with the family gathered on the house terrace, contemplating the distant lights of the port and listening to the murmur of the sea. They toasted one more time, this time not for the sentence or for the triumph, but for life itself and for the strength that had kept them united. Eleanor lay back with tranquility, aware that that night she would sleep in peace with no shadows to haunt her. Alejandro sighed deeply, grateful for the opportunity to see his daughter free and hopeful. Patricia and Manuel exchanged a complicit smile, knowing that the path continued, but now with a clear horizon. Thus, under the starry sky of Valencia, the story of pain and redemption found its closure. It was not a fairy tale ending, but the conclusion of a real struggle, full of tears and lessons, of silences and words. Eleanor knew that there were still challenges, but also that she had regained something invaluable: trust in herself and in the family that accompanied her. And while the night wind gently caressed the balconies, everyone understood that what they had lived would be etched not as a wound, but as a luminous scar that would always remind them of the importance of justice, of love, and of shared strength. Interactive elements prompting question. The story emphasizes that Alejandro's true redemption was not in his power, but in his change as a father. How did his final actions and words show this? Call to action. Share your thoughts on what this story teaches us about justice and what it truly means to be a hero in a family. Discussion. Do you think James will ever be able to recover and face the consequences of his actions? Question for the reader. How did the recurring imagery of the hospital, the city of Valencia, and the family's home symbolize Eleanor's journey?